Throughout history, few questions have sparked more controversy than the true nature of Jesus' origins. Edgar Cayce, often called the sleeping prophet, had profound insights into this topic that challenged traditional narratives while deepening our spiritual understanding. His psychic readings revealed connections to ancient wisdom that many religious authorities have struggled to accept, revelations about Jesus' parentage that align with forgotten esoteric traditions rather than conventional doctrine. Before we continue, drop a quick hi in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Edgar Cayce would often say that truth arrives not in thunderous proclamations, but in whispers to the ready heart. His journey into the Akashic records, what he described as the universal memory of all that has ever happened, provided him unique insights into Jesus' life and lineage. When exploring these records during his trance states, Cayce discovered patterns and connections that conventional historical accounts had either missed or deliberately obscured. What if, Cayce would pose in his readings, our understanding of divine parentage transcends biological conception? This question forms the foundation of his revelations about Jesus' true father, revelations that reframe our understanding while preserving the sacred mystery of Christ's mission on earth. In reading 57:4-9-8, Cayce described how souls choose their entry points into physical existence, including the circumstances of their birth. For Jesus, this was no ordinary soul journey, but the culmination of multiple incarnations leading to a pivotal moment in human history. According to Cayce, the soul that became Jesus had previously incarnated as Adam, Enoch, Melchizedek, Joshua, Jeshua, and Zend, father of Zoroaster, each life building toward the Christ consciousness that would fully manifest in Jesus. Cayce's readings affirmed the virgin birth, but with nuances that expand its meaning beyond literal interpretation. In reading 57:49-7, he stated, "As to the material interpretation, yes, Joseph was the father of Jesus. Yet in the same reading, he maintained that the entrance of the Logos, the Christ consciousness, came through divine means." This seeming contradiction reveals Cayce's multidimensional understanding of fatherhood, one that encompasses both physical and spiritual dimensions. What was this Christ consciousness that Cayce spoke of? He described it as the perfect awareness of oneness with the Creator, a state of being that transcends individual identity and merges with divine purpose. This consciousness, according to Cayce, is the true father of the Christ, more significant than any biological parentage. Jesus, through perfect alignment with this consciousness, embodied the divine pattern more completely than any soul before or since. "The Father and I are one," Jesus proclaimed in Scripture. Cayce's readings suggest this was not merely poetic language, but a precise description of Jesus' spiritual reality. The Father was not a separate entity, but the universal consciousness from which all souls emanate and to which all eventually return. Jesus' unique achievement was maintaining unbroken awareness of this connection throughout his earthly life. In reading 25:33-8, Cayce elaborated, "For as the Father had life in himself, so gave he to the Son to have life in himself, even so that the Spirit, as the Father of all, might be manifested." This suggests that God, the universal consciousness, was indeed Jesus' Father, but not in the simplified way often portrayed in religious teachings. Rather, this divine parentage represents a pattern available to all souls, with Jesus as the exemplar who achieved it perfectly. Why, then, has this understanding been censored through the centuries, as our title suggests? Cayce's readings indicate that controlling religious authorities found it threatening to acknowledge that Christ consciousness is the birthright of all souls. If Jesus' divine connection came through the same consciousness accessible to everyone, then religious hierarchies lose their exclusive claim as intermediaries to the divine. The message that we are all children of God, in the same spiritual lineage as Jesus, undermines systems of control built on spiritual inequality. During the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, church authorities standardized Christian doctrine, making selections about which gospels and teachings would become canonical. Cayce's readings suggest that numerous texts containing deeper esoteric understandings of Christ's nature and parentage were deliberately excluded, not because they denied Jesus' divinity, but because they defined that divinity in universal terms that threatened ecclesiastical authority. The Essenes play a crucial role in Cayce's narrative about Jesus' origins. This Jewish sect, dedicated to spiritual purification and mystical understanding, had prepared for generations for the coming of the Messiah. According to Cayce's readings, Mary had been raised and trained in Essene traditions, specifically for her role as Jesus' mother. The Essenes understood conception not merely as a physical act, but as a sacred alignment of spiritual forces. In reading 2067:7, Cayce stated, "Mary was of the household or family of Joachim, of the tribe of Judah, of the lineage of David." The Essenes, recognizing special qualities in Mary from her birth, dedicated her to temple service. There she received education in spiritual practices that would prepare her to receive and nurture the Christ consciousness in physical form. Joseph, too, was part of this Essene tradition, chosen as Mary's husband precisely because he understood the spiritual significance of their union. Far from being a passive bystander, Joseph was, according to Cayce, spiritually prepared for his role in providing the earthly environment for Jesus' development. The traditional narrative of Joseph as merely a legal guardian misses his deeper spiritual significance in Cayce's readings. What does this mean for our understanding of the true father of Jesus? Cayce's readings suggest multiple levels of fatherhood. Joseph as the physical father, providing genetic material, God as the spiritual father, providing the Christ consciousness, and the Essene tradition as the contextual father, providing the cultural and spiritual framework for Jesus' development and mission. This multidimensional understanding was considered dangerous to religious authorities who preferred simple narratives that located divine authority outside ordinary human experience. By emphasizing Jesus' difference from humanity rather than his exemplary fulfillment of human potential, these authorities could position themselves as necessary intermediaries to the divine. Cayce's readings challenge us to reconsider what divine conception truly means. Rather than focusing on the mechanics of Jesus' birth, Cayce directed attention to the consciousness that Jesus embodied, a consciousness potentially available to all souls. The Christ spirit within, the Christ consciousness, is the hope of glory, he stated in Reading 262-103. For Cayce, the miracle of Jesus wasn't that he had a different father than other humans, but that he fully realized the divine consciousness that all humans share. His readings consistently emphasize that Jesus came as a pattern for humanity, not as an unreachable exception, but as the first fruit of what all might become. The censorship of this understanding served specific purposes throughout history. Religious institutions maintained control by emphasizing humanity's separation from divinity rather than our essential oneness with it. Political powers aligned themselves with these religious structures to reinforce authority. The result was a Christianity that often lost sight of its founder's central message: the kingdom of God is within you. In reading 25:33-7, Cayce stated, Jesus became the first of those that overcame death in the body, enabling him to so illuminate, to so revivify that body as to take it up again, even when it had been destroyed. This achievement, according to Cayce, demonstrates the potential within all human consciousness when fully aligned with divine purpose, a potential stemming from our shared spiritual parentage. The true revelation about Jesus' Father, then, isn't a scandalous alternative to the traditional narrative, but a deeper understanding of what divine parentage actually means. In Cayce's view, focusing on biological fatherhood misses the more profound spiritual reality. That consciousness, not genetics, determines one's true nature and potential. This perspective helps us understand why certain Gnostic texts were excluded from the biblical canon. Works like the Gospel of Thomas, with its emphasis on the divine light within each person, aligned with Cayce's insights about Christ consciousness as our shared inheritance. Such texts were threatening precisely because they democratized access to the divine, undermining hierarchical control of spiritual experience. The Essene communities, according to Cayce, preserved these deeper understandings through initiatic traditions. They recognized that certain truths could only be comprehended through direct spiritual experience rather than intellectual assent to doctrine. This approach to spiritual knowledge, emphasizing experience over belief, has been repeatedly marginalized throughout Christian history, yet it aligns perfectly with Jesus' own teaching methods. When Jesus spoke of being born again, Cayce's readings suggest he was referring to the awakening of Christ consciousness within the individual soul, a second birth more significant than the first. This spiritual rebirth reflects the true divine parentage available to all, with God as the Father not just of Jesus, but of every soul willing to awaken to its divine nature. The controversy surrounding Jesus' parentage, then, reflects a deeper controversy about human potential. If Jesus' divine Father is understood as the universal consciousness accessible to all souls, then the boundary between the human and divine becomes permeable. This understanding threatens systems that depend on maintaining separation between God and humanity, with designated authorities controlling access across that boundary. Cayce's readings suggest that Jesus himself taught this more expansive understanding during his ministry, particularly to his closest disciples. The parables, healing works, and private teachings all pointed toward the reality of God consciousness as the birthright of every soul. His statement, "Greater things than these shall you do," reflects his understanding that others could access the same divine consciousness that empowered his own works. Archaeological discoveries since Cayce's time have lent support to aspects of his readings. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed much about Essene communities and practices that align with Cayce's descriptions. Discoveries at Nag Hammadi uncovered Gnostic texts expressing understandings of Christ consciousness similar to those in Cayce's readings. These findings suggest that the censored understandings Cayce accessed were indeed part of early Christian thought, preserved in communities eventually marginalized as heretical. What might change if we embraced Cayce's understanding of Jesus' true Father? Perhaps most significantly, we would recognize divine potential as our shared inheritance rather than the exclusive possession of a single historical figure. The emphasis would shift from worshiping Jesus to following his example of awakening to our divine nature. Spiritual authority would reside in direct experience rather than institutional validation. This shift aligns with Cayce's broader message about humanity's spiritual evolution. He saw Jesus not as an anomaly, but as the first wave of a transformation available to all souls, the full realization of divinity within human form. The question becomes not whether we accept Jesus as the only Son of God, but whether we recognize ourselves as expressions of the same divine consciousness that he perfectly embodied. The true Father of Jesus, in Cayce's understanding, is the universal consciousness from which all souls emerge and to which all return. Joseph provided the physical vehicle, Mary the purified vessel, and the Essene tradition the spiritual framework. But the animating force was the Christ consciousness itself, the perfect awareness of oneness with the Creator. This consciousness is our true heritage, censored not by erasing texts, but by conditioning us to see ourselves as separate from the divine. Jesus' words, "I and the Father are one," thus become not a unique claim, but an invitation, a reminder of our own potential for divine communion. The censorship of this understanding serves those who benefit from human disempowerment, from our forgetting of our divine nature. By reclaiming this knowledge, we fulfill what Cayce saw as the true purpose of Jesus' life, not to be worshipped as an exception, but to be followed as a pattern for our own spiritual awakening. The shocking revelation, then, is not about scandal, but about possibility. The possibility that divine consciousness is not foreign to human nature, but its truest expression. This understanding doesn't diminish Jesus, but elevates our comprehension of his significance as the way shower for humanity's spiritual evolution. Throughout history, those who accessed this deeper understanding often faced persecution. Mystics, Gnostics, and contemplatives who emphasized direct communion with the divine frequently found themselves at odds with religious authorities. Yet this understanding has persisted, resurfacing in each generation through those willing to look beyond literal interpretations to the spiritual truths they represent. Cayce himself faced criticism for readings that challenged orthodox interpretations. Yet he maintained that his insights came not from intellectual speculation, but from direct access to the Akashic records, the same universal consciousness that Jesus had fully embodied. His readings consistently emphasized that the story of Jesus' life was meant to illuminate the path available to all souls, not to establish an unbridgeable gap between divinity and humanity. The true power of understanding Jesus' divine parentage comes when we recognize it as a pattern for our own spiritual journey. We too are expressions of divine consciousness temporarily clothed in physical form. We too can awaken to our true nature as children of the universal consciousness. We too can manifest the Christ pattern in our lives, though perhaps not with the perfection that Jesus achieved. What Edgar Cayce revealed through his readings was not a rejection of Jesus' divinity, but a deeper understanding of what that divinity actually means, not as something foreign to human nature, but as its fullest expression. The censorship of this understanding comes not primarily through the destruction of texts, but through the conditioning of consciousness to accept limitation rather than possibility. As we contemplate these revelations about Jesus' true Father, we're invited to reconsider our own spiritual parentage. Are we merely physical beings, products of biological processes and social conditioning? Or are we, like Jesus, expressions of divine consciousness, temporarily experiencing human form? The answer to this question fundamentally shapes how we understand our purpose and potential. Cayce's readings consistently affirm that Jesus came not to be worshipped, but to demonstrate possibilities, to show what human consciousness can achieve when fully aligned with divine purpose. His life reveals not his difference from us, but his perfect fulfillment of what we all might become. This understanding threatens power structures built on human limitation rather than human potential. The true Father of Jesus, then, is the same Father accessible to all who awaken to their divine nature. The censorship of this understanding serves those who benefit from humanity's spiritual amnesia, our forgetting of our divine origins and potential. By reclaiming this knowledge, we participate in the spiritual evolution that Cayce saw as humanity's destiny. What does this mean for us today? It means that each person has access to the same divine consciousness that Jesus embodied, not through special dispensation, but through the natural birthright of every soul. It means that spiritual authority resides not in external institutions, but in direct communion with the divine presence within. It means that Jesus' invitation to follow me is not about worship, but about awakening to our shared divine nature. The Christ consciousness that fathered Jesus' spiritual identity is available to all who seek it. This is the revelation that religious authorities have found threatening throughout history, not because it diminishes Jesus, but because it empowers individuals to access divinity directly, without institutional mediation. The censorship of this understanding reflects the persistent human tendency to create hierarchies of spiritual access rather than recognizing the universal availability of divine communion. Edgar Cayce's readings invite us to move beyond literal interpretations to the spiritual truths they represent. The virgin birth, divine conception, and Holy Family narrative contain profound symbolic meanings about the integration of divine consciousness into human experience. By fixating on historical or biological details, we often miss the transformative spiritual message these stories were meant to convey. The true censorship, according to Cayce's perspective, has not been primarily of texts, but of consciousness itself, conditioning us to accept spiritual limitation rather than infinite possibility. By reclaiming our understanding of divine parentage, we participate in the awakening that Cayce saw as humanity's destiny. We recognize that the same universal consciousness that fathered Jesus' spiritual identity lives within each of us, waiting to be fully realized. In this understanding, Jesus stands not as an unattainable ideal, but as the elder brother showing us our own potential. His perfect embodiment of Christ consciousness reveals what is possible when a soul fully aligns with divine purpose. The miracle of his life was not that he had a different father than humanity, but that he fully realized the divine consciousness that all humans share. The shocking revelation about the true Father of Jesus is ultimately a revelation about ourselves, about our own divine parentage and potential. By recognizing the universal consciousness as the true Father of all souls, we reclaim our spiritual heritage and responsibility. We move beyond worship to emulation, beyond doctrine to direct experience, beyond separation to oneness. This understanding transforms not just our view of Jesus, but our comprehension of our own purpose and potential. We are not merely physical beings seeking spiritual experience, but spiritual beings having a physical experience. The Christ consciousness that Jesus perfectly embodied is our own deepest identity, waiting to be awakened and expressed. The censorship of this understanding throughout history reflects humanity's persistent resistance to its own divinity, our tendency to project divine qualities outward rather than recognizing them within. By reclaiming knowledge of our true spiritual parentage, we participate in the awakening that Cayce saw as humanity's destiny, the recognition that we are all children of the same divine consciousness that Jesus called Father. Edgar Cayce's readings consistently emphasize that Jesus came not to establish a religion, but to demonstrate possibilities, to show what human consciousness can achieve when fully aligned with divine purpose. His life reveals not his separation from humanity, but his perfect fulfillment of human potential. This understanding threatens systems built on human limitation rather than human possibility. The true revelation about Jesus' Father is not about biological parentage, but about the universal consciousness that fathers all souls. This consciousness, fully realized in Jesus, but present in all, represents our true spiritual heritage. By awakening to this reality, we fulfill what Cayce saw as the purpose of Jesus' life, not to be worshipped as unique, but to be followed as a pattern for our own spiritual development. The Christ consciousness that found perfect expression in Jesus is available to all who seek it. This is the revelation that has been repeatedly censored throughout history, not by destroying texts, but by conditioning consciousness to accept limitation rather than infinite possibility. By reclaiming our understanding of divine parentage, we participate in the spiritual evolution that Cayce envisioned for humanity. In the final analysis, the question of Jesus' true Father points beyond historical or biological considerations to the universal consciousness from which all souls emerge. This consciousness, perfectly embodied in Jesus but present in all, represents our shared spiritual heritage and destiny. By awakening to this reality, we fulfill what Cayce saw as the true purpose of Jesus' mission, to demonstrate the divine potential within every human soul. What if the greatest secret isn't about Jesus at all, but about us? What if his life was meant to reveal not his uniqueness, but our shared divine nature? What if the true Father of Jesus is the same universal consciousness that fathers all souls? These questions invite us not just to revise history, but to reawaken to our own divine potential, the Christ consciousness that is our true inheritance and destiny. The revelations about the true Father of Jesus that Edgar Cayce accessed through his readings ultimately point us toward recognizing our own divine parentage. The same universal consciousness that Jesus called Father is available to all who awaken to their true nature. This understanding doesn't diminish Jesus' achievement, but places it in the context of humanity's spiritual evolution, as the pattern for what all might eventually become. I've shared with you today perspectives that emerged from Edgar Cayce's remarkable psychic readings that offer profound insights into Jesus' true parentage and its significance for humanity's spiritual journey. These understandings invite us to move beyond literal interpretations to the spiritual truths they represent, truths about our own divine nature and potential. The true shock isn't about scandal or conspiracy, but about possibility. The possibility that divine consciousness is not foreign to human nature, but its truest expression. By reclaiming this understanding, we participate in the spiritual awakening that Cayce saw as humanity's destiny. We recognize that the same universal consciousness that fathered Jesus' spiritual identity lives within each of us, waiting to be fully realized. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of history's most profound spiritual mysteries. If these ideas resonated with you, please leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one and value your perspective. Your engagement through likes and shares helps bring these transformative ideas to others, seeking deeper understanding. Subscribe to our channel for more explorations of spiritual truths that transcend conventional understanding. Together, we're rediscovering wisdom that illuminates not just history, but our own divine potential. Remember, the greatest revelation isn't about who Jesus was, but about who we are becoming.